Okay, welcome to the deep dive. So, you've sent us these fascinating excerpts from Forgotten Wars, which really pulls back the curtain on that incredibly turbulent time in Southeast Asia and India right after World War II.
Hmm.
We're looking specifically at that whole stretch, from eastern India down to Singapore, what used to be the commercial heart, really, of Britain's Asian empire.
Sure.
And our goal today, using these sources you sent, is really to unpack those birth pangs, as the book calls them, the birth pangs of a new Asian world emerging between, 1945 and 49.
Yeah.
Because this material makes it so clear, it wasn't some neat, tidy transition. It was messy, full of intense struggle, violence, competing visions. It goes way beyond the simple stories we sometimes get.
Oh, absolutely. And messy is exactly the word. I mean, right after Japan's surrender, it was anything but a smooth return to order.
Right.
What these sources really show is this landscape of just widespread chaos,
Mm.
huge uncertainty. And suddenly, these powerful local forces pop up, nationalist, political, sometimes armed, all challenging the colonial powers who are trying to uh, step back in.
Hmm.
So yeah, we're looking at this critical time where the big world war ended, but, well, a whole lot of local, often really brutal fights. We're just getting started.
Okay, so let's dive right into that chaotic dawn. What do the sources actually paint, picture-wise, of those first few months? Right after the surrender in 45, what did it look like?
Well, it's varied. You had cheering crowds in places like Rangoon when the news broke.
Okay.
But then in Japan itself, immense devastation, really mixed emotions. The material even mentions this dark image of some Japanese beating American POWs who survived the atomic blast.
Wow.
While for many others, the surrender just felt like, well, the end of the world, like a natural disaster.
Yeah.
And for the incoming victors, the British, for example, what really struck them was the sheer destruction. They were apparently astonished Japan had held out so long.
Hmm.
But underneath all that, the disruption was just profound.
And the sources really seem to hammer home the physical side of that, the devastation, the human cost,
Hmm.
all the displaced people. Tell us about the Javanese Ramusha, those forced laborers, and the situation in somewhere like Singapore.
Yeah, this is one of the most striking things. Thousands of these forced laborers, the Ramusha, were just left stranded, often in appalling conditions.
Right.
The accounts describe them haunting places, like the Singapore railway station,
Sure.
looking, quote, half-dead like skeletons. I mean,
Or
by late 45, there were still something like 18,000 of them just in Malaya alone. Imagine that scale.
God, yeah.
And Singapore itself was just reeling from the occupation, severe overcrowding, just making the daily scramble for food, for basics, incredibly hard. This human debris of war, as the sources put it. It was a mass, immediate challenge for the returning British.
So physical collapse, and then politically, you mentioned these power vacuums opening up as the Japanese withdrew, particularly in Malaya, it seems. Who stepped into that gap?
Right, and that's where the Malayan People's Anti-Japanese Army, the MPAJ,
Yeah.
becomes really central. These were mainly Chinese communist-led fighters. They'd resisted the Japanese from the jungle.
Mm.
And now, wearing their new SEAC jungle green uniforms, they moved incredibly fast.
How fast?
Well, the sources say they seized village police stations, arms dumps. They set up these people's committees. And, well, one estimate claims a staggering 70% of rural towns.
70%. Wow.
And their mobility was key. They grabbed transport. And you even hear about them burning land office records. Almost symbolic, erasing the old order.
Mm.
And initially, they were actually welcomed, even by some local capitalists,
Yeah.
surprisingly. They used this evocative phrase, white skin, red hearts.
White skin, red hearts. That's fascinating. So it sounds like the returning British weren't the only ones looking for local allies in this vacuum.
Not at all. The material points to other anti-Japanese Malay groups, too, like Askar Malayu Setia and Watania, particularly strong in states like Perak and Pahang. And the British covertly supported these groups. It wasn't just about military help. It was politically important. It was about demonstrating Malay loyalty to the empire and, crucially, trying to counterbalance the MPAJ's growing influence.
Right.
You even had American OSS agents involved. There's this curious incident mentioned where a small OSS team working with Watanaya actually captured the Sultan of Pahang.
Really? Why?
Well, ostensibly it was to stop him falling into communist hands. But, the underlying dynamic was all about navigating this incredibly complicated local political scene, everyone trying to position themselves.
It really does sound like multiplayer chess in a power vacuum. So what about the actual British and Indian troops coming back? How are they received on the ground?
Well, the accounts suggest a lot of tension, uncertainty. The first British troops got to Kuala Lumpur September 12th, found the streets deserted.
Not exactly welcoming.
No. One officer's comment is telling. If the populace were happy to see us, they proved adept at concealing their emotions. And the MTIJ was already there, established. You also see confrontations happening, especially involving the North Indian troops of 5 Division. Sometimes they initially mistook MPIJ fighters for Japanese.
Oh, right.
Plus language barriers and just war weariness.
Yeah.
People on the ground were deeply suspicious of anyone in uniform after years of occupation.
And the treatment of the defeated Japanese themselves, the sources seem to highlight some pretty grim images there, too.
They do. It wasn't gentle. The sources describe these public spectacles, really designed to humiliate the Japanese prisoners.
Like what?
Well, in Singapore, you had them leveling the Padang, that big field for Mountbatten's arrival. Some apparently still showed up in white gloves, drew crowds who jeered them.
Right.
In places like Perak, conditions were grim. Japanese POWs assigned to dredge a dry dock reportedly died after being forced to use just jam tins.
Just grief.
Now, maybe troops arriving later were less hardened, but the veterans, especially from the brutal Burma campaign, well, understandably, they held little charity.
This connected arc of protest you mentioned earlier,
Yeah.
it seems clearer when you look beyond just Malaya. The sources talk about India, Indonesia, Indochina, and how Indian troops ended up involved there.
Yes, this is a really crucial thread in the material, I think. Indian troops, remember, fighting as part of the British forces. They suddenly found themselves deployed to put down these new nationalist movements.
Right, against people fighting for their own independence.
Exactly. In Indonesia, on behalf of the returning Dutch.
Mm.
In Indochina for the French. And the sources show this fascinating propaganda targeting those Indian soldiers.
Oh.
Yeah, English and Vietnamese leaflets circulating, sometimes lyrically linking the Vietnamese struggle with India's own fight for freedom, asking why Indian soldiers were fighting for evil capitalists, highlighting objections from leaders like Nehru back home about them even being there.
And that must have connected directly to the Indian National Army, the INA, and those hugely controversial trials back in India. That surely ratcheted up the tension domestically.
Immensely. It was a complete political minefield. You had British commanders, Wavell, Auchinleck. They felt a duty to trial the INA men, especially those who joined the Japanese and committed atrocities against other Indian troops. They felt they owed it to the loyal soldiers. It was about rebellion against the King Emperor.
But the Indian leaders saw it differently.
Very differently. Congress leaders, especially Nehru, while privately, maybe concerned about the loyalty question for a future Indian army, publicly, they championed the INA men, called them misguided perhaps, but fundamentally real patriots.
Yeah.
This created a massive political storm, and as one source puts it, it contributed hugely to the white man's EZAT, that kind of aura of authority and charisma finally just evaporating.
And that unrest wasn't just political debate, was it? It exploded into actual violence, particularly in the Calcutta riots.
Yes, the Calcutta riots described here sound incredibly intense. The city was just convulsed. You had youth, communists, supporters of Supos Bose, all demonstrating solidarity with the INA prisoners.
What kind of things happened?
The description is visceral. Cars burned out, shop windows smashed, Britons and Anglo-Indians being waylaid, abused. There's that striking detail about ritual humiliation rioters sometimes stealing their regimental ties or pith helmets. And the military response, Operation St. Bernard, was huge. 45,000 troops deployed, British, Gurkha, even one Indian unit trying to rescue civilians caught in just horrific communal violence. One civil servant compared it chillingly to the famine.
Good Lord.
Gandhi was appalled by the violence, but he also noted the contrast, the vigorous British response here compared to, say, their slower action during the Quit India movement back in '42.
So we've seen the immediate chaos, the spreading political pressure. Now, as we move into 1946, 1947, independence movements really start gathering steam.
Right.
What does the material show about Burma's path during this time?
Well, Burmese politicians were definitely watching India very closely.
Okay.
When India's interim government took office, they felt spurred on. They noted, somewhat resentfully perhaps, that Burma hadn't got the same high-level attention, no grand cabinet mission like India received.
Right.
Governor Hubert Rance noted their hostility immediately upon arrival. And then, September 1946, things almost boiled over into full-scale rebellion, a large mass movement. Substantial parts of the countryside basically fell out of central government control.
Were they armed?
Yes, anti-government forces had managed to get hold of automatic weapons, large ammo stockpiles. Aung San's leadership during that crisis was absolutely critical in just trying to navigate it, keep some sort of control.
And the sources give us a sense of the British view of Aung San, too, and this feeling that independence was becoming, well, inevitable.
It's fascinating, isn't it? You see these different takes. You had figures like Churchill privately dismissing Aung San as a quisling or a fascist.
Right.
But the new Labour government in London,
Mhm.
particularly Attlee and Cripps, they had connections to Indian socialists like Nehru and Menon, and the sources suggest this led to a more, well, paternalistic view, maybe sometimes undiscriminating, towards Indians compared to other Asians. Wavell, near the end of his time as viceroy, met Aung San, described him as a suspicious, ignorant, but determined little tough. But, and this is the crucial bit, he also concluded that business could be done,
Ah.
and that there was simply no viable alternative to dealing with Aung San's party, the AFPFL.
Mm.
The momentum from the British perspective on the ground just felt unstoppable by then.
So while Burma's pushing hard, Malaya is bogged down in its own constitutional battles. The sources really detail these Malayan Union proposals and the incredibly strong reaction they provoked.
Yeah, these proposals were meant to tie Malaya much more closely to the empire, integrate it more, but they completely misread the Malay mood. They triggered absolutely massive protests right across the peninsula.
How did that play out?
Well, the material highlights the key role of the Malay sultans. They'd initially signed agreements with the British envoy, MacMichael, but then they repudiated them, traveled to London to lobby, and they found these powerful, maybe unexpected allies, like the elderly Sir Frank Swettenham, a man who'd helped create British Malaya decades before.
Yeah.
But here he was, passionately defending Malay sovereignty against the Union.
Wow.
His warning to the Colonial Office was stark. He said, basically, delay revoking this union, and we would have Indonesia, meaning that level of unrest.
And wasn't there an alternative proposal put forward, an anti-federation movement?
Exactly. You saw this coalition forming, groups like the Malay Nationalist Party, and this broader alliance called Putera AMCJA.
Who were they?
A real mix, representing various ethnic groups, political interests, Chinese chambers of commerce, trade unions, and they drafted their own people's constitution.
Which went further than the British plan.
Significantly further. Key things were a strong emphasis on just sullying citizenship by birthright and promoting a shared Malayan identity. This directly challenged the British colonial habit of rigidly categorizing people. The sources even note the British census dissolved distinctions within Malays themselves.
This whole debate over identity, who counts as Malay, it sounds incredibly charged and complex.
Oh, it's fundamental.
Yeah.
And you see the political calculations involved. The 47 census showed Malays were 50% of the population, Chinese 38%, Indians 11%.
Okay.
The fact that Chinese community was growing faster caused real alarm among Malay leaders. Newspapers like Utazam Melayu launched campaigns, literally encouraging more Malay babies and urging Indonesians migrating to Malaya to identify specifically as Malays
Why?
to maintain that crucial political arithmetic. Population percentages equaled power under the British system. Now, the People's Constitution proposed Malay as the national language, Malay control over religion and custom that appealed to Malay identity, but its more inclusive ideas on citizenship. Well, they were ultimately rejected by those who prioritized Malay primacy.
And besides the constitutional fights, the sources also point to simmering labor tensions during this 46-47 period. It wasn't all high politics.
Not at all. Huge frustration on the ground. Wages just weren't keeping up with the cost of living after the war.
Right.
And one source notes, this distinction between rights and freedom, it was incomprehensible to local unionists. They saw labor issues and political freedom as completely intertwined. The British tried to kind of guide the trade unions, steer them. But incidents happened, like the arrest of a people's leader, Sun Kwong, for extortion. Now, the sources say he was probably guilty, but the timing right after a big rally was highly provocative.
Okay.
That led to hunger marches, strikes, and in one really grim incident, October 45, highlighted in sources, British commanders, fearing for their safety during a hunger march in Sungai Siput, ordered troops to fire on civilians.
Oh, no.
Yeah, people were killed. And this specific incident, Chin Peng, the later communist leader, would specifically claim that as the first blood for the Malayan Emergency.
So that brings us right up to 1948. The sources call it a bloody dawn, the real start of the communist rebellion. What was the specific trigger? How did it shift to full-scale conflict in Malaya?
Well, what's fascinating here is how the sources really emphasize this spark came from below. It apparently caught both the British and the communist leadership unawares and unprepared.
Really? Not planned.
Well, the Malayan Communist Party, the MCP, had issued orders back in May encouraging resistance. But a firm central command for armed revolt hadn't actually been given. It was kind of contingent on what the British did next.
Okay.
The immediate trigger was the murder of 3 European rubber planters, Arthur Walker, John Allison, Ian Christian, in Sungai Siput, same place as that earlier shooting, on June 16th.
Right.
And the sources are careful here. They point out the party leadership didn't plan these specific killings. They were more a consequence of those May orders, linked to bitter local disputes, often about evictions from estates.
Yeah.
There's even this striking, almost bizarre detail. One killer apparently respectfully greeted Walker before shooting him.
So the full-on armed struggle wasn't a centrally planned MCP launch, more like an accidental trigger.
According to these sources, that's exactly the picture.
Yeah.
No firm central command had been issued for revolt. But these unplanned murders at Sungai Siput, they provided the immediate catalyst. That triggered the full declaration of the emergency and the conflict that followed.
So how did the British administration react to this sudden eruption?
They reacted very strongly. And the sources note some controversial moves. One big one was bringing in veterans from Britain's other major imperial emergency happening at the same time, Palestine.
Ah, the Palestine police.
Exactly. Over 500 Palestine police sergeants were deployed to Malaya. And the sources say this added more divisions within the local police force. These guys had a paramilitary approach, sometimes a brutal reputation, which clashed with existing methods. Figures like Nicole Gray and later the High Commissioner Julian Gurney, who himself had Palestine experience, were brought in. But a major concern for Gurney, explicitly mentioned, was stopping Malaya turning into another Palestine ethnically. So he deliberately resisted calls for full martial law. He wanted to keep it officially a civilian emergency, not a war.
The sources also highlight some specific, very troubling incidents during the counterinsurgency itself.
Yes, a key one mentioned is the Batang Kali incident, December 1948. Scots guards killed a number of Chinese laborers who apparently ran from a hut during an interrogation.
Okay.
What's significant is that the sources point out questions were being asked about this at the time, even in the press. How could so many be killed with no injuries to the soldiers? How were they so sure they were guerrillas?
Was there an inquiry?
An official inquiry by the Attorney General was held, but its findings were never made public. And the material notes questions about Batang Kali were even raised back in Parliament in Britain.
And alongside the fighting, the British rolled out these huge detention and resettlement programs, didn't they?
Yes, this arguably became the defining British strategy, trying to cut off the communists, the MNLA, their armed wing, from their support base in the countryside.
Especially the Chinese squatters.
Particularly them, yes. Living on the jungle fringes, often providing food, shelter, intelligence. The sources describe initial plans highly controversial for mass deportations. Repatriation of Chinese back to China.
Did that happen?
It proved incredibly difficult to implement. It was called a scandal waiting to erupt. Faced internal opposition to a small rebellion of civil servants against the policy. So instead, they shifted to mass resettlement.
The new villages.
Exactly. Sometimes forcibly uprooting families, moving them into these guarded areas, the new villages. Often promised aid, like building timber, just failed to materialize, causing more hardship.
Who is actually doing most of the fighting on the ground for the government side, according to these sources?
Well, the sources describe the MNLA fighters in the jungle, drawing recruits from villagers, students. Notably, quite a few young women joined the revolution.
And on the other side?
On the government side, the heaviest casualties were borne by the police, and especially the special constables who were often Malay. The sources also note that the communists' revolutionary fury wasn't just aimed at the British. It fell heavily on small businessmen, contractors, villagers themselves, anyone seen as collaborating or not supporting the cause. By late 48, it's described as a deadlock in fighting terms, a brutal cycle of terror and counter-terror.
The material also gets into the really complex relationships between the MCP and other Chinese groups in Malaya, like the triads, even the Kuomintang. It wasn't simple.
No, that adds another whole layer. The MCP's ideology, more austere, it challenged the influence of the traditional Chinese secret societies, the triads. But, alliances and conflicts between them were fluid.
So they sometimes worked together, sometimes fought?
Yes. The sources describe actual open warfare breaking out between gangs and leftists in some areas. By late 47, many triad members in Penang were apparently linked to the Kuomintang, the Chinese nationalists, who were also recruiting for a secret army in Malaya at the time. And Chinese employers sometimes used triads to break strikes. The sources note British officials often saw the MCP's influence through this lens, this secret society complex. Perhaps, the book suggests, downplaying the genuine ideological commitment of some fighters.
And it feels like as the conflict dragged on, the British strategy started leaning more heavily on these existing ethnic structures to fight the communists.
Precisely. High Commissioner Gurney initially hoped maybe to foster a unified body led by English-educated Chinese leaders, but the reality on the ground pushed things differently.
Towards the MCA.
Yes, the Malayan Chinese Association, the MCA, formed in 1949, and the sources use this provocative description. The Kuomintang resurrected in all but name. It was led by these powerful China-born magnates, figures connected to chambers of commerce, clan associations. The MCA effectively became the communal counterpart to UMNO, the main Malay political party.
And what was its role?
Well, the sources suggest businessmen used it to restore and consolidate patronage networks, including taking control of school management committees, which the sources identify as really crucial battlegrounds for influence over the next generation.
The economic stake for Britain in Malaya during all this? It must have been huge, right? That must have been a factor.
Oh, huge, absolutely vital. Malaya's rubber and tin were incredibly valuable globally. By 1948, Malaya was generating a staggering $170 million surplus for the entire Sterling area,
Wow.
far more than any other colony. This massive economic stake was, without doubt, a primary driver behind Britain's determination to hold on to Malaya, especially after losing India and Burma. It absolutely fueled the counterinsurgency effort.
So looking back at this whole period, through the lens of these sources, it's clear the Malayan Emergency wasn't just some straightforward British military win, and this entire era had really deep, long-lasting consequences.
Yeah, the argument from this material is pretty compelling on that. It wasn't just a British military victory, partly because the conflict itself grew out of these deep-seated internal Malayan struggles, things brewing since the Japanese occupation.
Right.
The fate of the MNLA, the communists, the sources suggest,
Yeah.
was ultimately tied to their relationship with those rural communities, the squatters, the Orang Asli forest dwellers, groups that, ironically, some earlier British officials and even communists had built relationships with. The book argues the communist revolution ultimately founded on a false premise. They
Yeah.
expected this mass village uprising that just never really happened against a government that proved very tenacious.
The Cold War context is also presented as pretty crucial for understanding this time.
Yes, the sources definitely frame this period as the very start of a new great game playing out across South and Southeast Asia, this time involving the USSR and China.
How much influence did China have in Malaya specifically?
Well, while China supported movements elsewhere, its ability to directly influence the war in Malaya was actually limited. But the broader Cold War climate, intense British anti-communism, growing U.S. suspicion of newly independent India, that ironically created a context that led to tacit support for more authoritarian regimes emerging across the region, perhaps compared to more liberal possibilities that might have seemed open earlier.
And the sources really stress the enduring impact on the region's economies and especially ethnic relations.
Absolutely. Things we associate with modern Asia, concepts like crony capitalism, these sources trace roots back to practices during both the British and Japanese periods. And crucially, those political compromises hammered out during this really turbulent transfer of power. They often proved unstable later on. They significantly contributed to ethnic tensions that would erupt down the line.
Like Singapore leaving Malaysia.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Singapore's eventual separation from Malaysia. The sources note it was clearly foreshadowed by events way back in 1946-47, by the alarm among Malay elites about Singapore's predominantly Chinese politics even then. This whole period really laid the groundwork for ongoing efforts to restructure societies, economies, very often along ethnic lines.
And finally, the sources touch on the legacy for figures like Chin Peng himself and maybe why these have become forgotten wars.
Yeah, it's quite poignant. Chin Peng is described almost as this mythic figure, still continuing his struggle in exile long after the emergency officially ended.
Yeah.
His attempt to return to Malaysia, just in 2004, years later, it starkly highlights how unresolved these conflicts, these narratives can remain. You know, who gets included in the national story? Who gets cast out? The material also mentions Nehru's stance changing. By 1950, with India independent, he's urging Indians in Malaya to look inward, condemning terrorism. It shows how even that early pan-Asian solidarity started to fracture as these new nations turned inward, grappling with their own massive internal problems.
This deep dive, using the sources you've shared, it really does reveal a far messier, more complex, often much more violent story than those simple independence narratives sometimes suggest.
Mhm.
It was a time of just seismic change, these conflicting visions for what came next, and the very real, often incredibly bloody birth pangs of a new Asia.
It really powerfully underscores that the end of empire,
Hmm.
it wasn't a single neat event, not overnight.
No.
It was this incredibly turbulent, multifaceted process, driven just as much, maybe even more, by local forces, improvisations on the ground,
Mm.
and these completely unexpected triggers, like those murders in Sungaysiput, playing absolutely critical roles.
And these forgotten wars, these choices made often unplanned during this chaos, they didn't just happen and then fade away. They profoundly shaped the political, economic, social landscape of Southeast Asia for decades after.
Absolutely. And what's fascinating, I think, is, well, when you look at countries like Malaysia, Singapore today, their ethnic relations, economic structures, political dynamics, you realize just how much of that present-day reality can still be traced directly back to these turbulent, often overlooked, often unplanned events between 1945 and 1949.
It really does make you consider, doesn't it? How much of the world we live in now is a direct, and perhaps sometimes quite unintended, consequence of struggles and conflicts that have largely just slipped out of mainstream historical memory.
Sobering thought.
Well, thank you for bringing this incredible material to light and joining us for this deep dive. We really hope it gives all of you listening something significant to think about and maybe inspires you to look a bit closer at some of the stories we've forgotten.